you open your book with the story of Mike Jackson, who's a manufacturing plant worker in Wisconsin. And was what we came to know as an essential worker, the workers who bore the brunt of the coronavirus pandemic and were certainly taking the biggest share of sacrifice, if you will. Let's just start there with his story and how it aligns with the timeline of the way the Trump administration started lying about this. And I, as you mentioned briefly, this doesn't just your book doesn't just focus on the Trump administration, but of course that's the place I think we should start.
It's a jumping off point. And in fact, even the chapter on Mike Jackson doesn't just talk about Trump. It talks about corporate malfeasance. It talks about political malfeasance by folks like Mitch McConnell, who literally held up coronavirus aid in a failed effort to try and do a broad immunity from liability for multinational corporations. So there's a lot of blame to go around here. But Mike Jackson is, one of many people I highlight in the book, folks who tragically died as a result of the pandemic. And what I try to do in each chapter is to look at someone who lost their life and then to track back and see the people who could have taken actions that might well have, or would almost certainly have saved that person. And in the case of Mike Jackson, he worked at a Briggs and Stratton plant in suburban Milwaukee. He was called an essential worker, and right off the bat, that's where you start to raise questions about how we handled the pandemic, because what he was making was lawn care products. And if you know anything about Wisconsin in February and March, we've got snow on the ground. We're not, quite as desperate for lawn care products. So the question of whether his work whether it was necessary for him to go into that factory is a really good one. But let's accept that he was there. And let's also recognize that he had a very large family. He worked very, very hard to support them. And he was very concerned at that point, especially about keeping his job. Because remember, we were told at the start of the pandemic that there was going to be a sweeping economic downturn, that there would be lots of layoffs. There were a lot of people who lost their jobs. And so he kept coming to work. But Mike Jackson and other workers in that plant said, we don't feel safe. They indicated directly and through their union that they thought there wasn't sufficient protection. They worked in a setting where they were literally facing other workers, but there weren't shields that protected them sufficiently in that setting. They didn't have other protective gear. And so they actually raised the alarm and they didn't get a sufficient response. Mike Jackson got sick. He left work one day. And then, as so many people who are in tough economic situations who want to support their families, he was afraid he was going to lose his job. And so he came back and kept working. He got sicker and sicker. He finally collapsed at his machine, ultimately taken to the hospital. He died. And his death was one of so many that came in that period and, the first stages of the pandemic that it could have easily been forgotten. But activists in Milwaukee, folks active in union groups, but also with Voces de la Frontera, which is an immigrant rights and worker rights organization, remembered his name. They brought it up again and again and again. They made his story central to a message about the need to have government regulations that protected workers, that were very, very strict, that put OSHA, on, kind of red alert and moved in a very serious way, to have stronger union protections, and this is perhaps most importantly, to make sure that corporations could be held to account if they didn't treat workers in a humane and responsible way during the pandemic. And so I followed Mike Jackson's story, after his death, through the many months when people did say his name and demanded that political figures and economic powerful institutions, corporations, and others did not forget him. Now, the tragedy is that when there was a memorial service in Milwaukee for Mike Jackson and others who had died right before the November election, Donald Trump was in the other part of Wisconsin, a battleground state, campaigning. And on the very day of that memorial service, Donald Trump was saying, COVID, 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 that all they ever talk about is COVID. I'm sick of it. Well, he may have been sick of it politically, but there were people who got sick and died because of his failures and because of the failures of corporations that owed their workers so much more.
Yeah, and it's amazing how they're at the time that these corporations were failing their workers, the biggest push that we saw from the leadership of one of the two major parties in this country was to provide the corporations with a shield of liability, which should not be shocking to anybody who has followed the Republican Party over the past few decades. But that's the reality, and it should, holding them accountable should be reckoning with that fact that this is the death cult of the Republican Party, or the death cult and the upholding of capitalism at all costs. That is the definition of the Republican Party, and that's how members of the Trump administration that you focus on, Mike Pence and Jared Kushner and Mike Pompeo, that's how they operated.
It is absolutely how they operated. And, they operated with a combination of, extreme self-service and absolute incompetence. And I think it's important to detail it. Jared Kushner was put in charge of supply chain issues. He had a thing called Operation Airbridge that was, and Emma, this will not surprise you. They're working with a college roommate. Jared Kushner came up with a plan to make sure that we got all the protective gear that we needed. And the plan was to use the power of the U.S. government economically and in other ways to help corporations to import protective gear, which they then could sell for a profit. And so the gear didn't get to where it needed to go. It was such a disastrous approach, so irresponsible and so emblematic of crony capitalism and frankly, disaster capitalism that the program was shut down very quickly. But today we talk a lot about supply chain problems. And it's important to recognize that at the root of a lot of them is not just members of the Trump administration, but others in Congress and, in fact, frankly, some Democrats as well, who supported a free trade regimen that put the United States in a place when this pandemic hit where we weren't manufacturing.
Rahm Emanuel, who you mentioned later in your book, I mean, maybe you could tie that part in as well, because these supply chain issues that you flesh out in the Kushner part of your book, that's been a part of neoliberal policy for many decades at this point.
You're exactly right. And in doing this book, I talked to a lot of people. I spoke very early on with Sherrod Brown, the senator from Ohio, and with a lot of other experts on manufacturing. And one of the things they said at the very beginning of the pandemic is, we have hollowed out those areas of our manufacturing sector that are so vitally important to having the protective gear, the respirators, all of the equipment we need in an emergency situation. And because this was a global pandemic, we were competing with other countries as well. Now, many of those other countries were manufacturing their own gear, their own goods. The United States had to play catch up. And it's very, very important when we talk about accountability that we don't just live in the moment, that we track back to those who took actions, those who did things along the way that made our circumstance more difficult. And that's why I have a chapter on Rahm Emanuel, a Democrat who always shows up in every administration. He's now ambassador to Japan, or headed toward ambassador to Japan, but who again and again and again pushed a free trade approach that was dictated by and in the service of multinational corporations, rather than being in the service of the good of the great mass of American people. And that really came back to hit us hard during the pandemic. And so one of the things I try to do with the book is I do try to have that human element throughout. The people who got sick and suffered and died, I don't want to forget their stories. I also want to look at the powerful who could have done things that might have prevented those deaths. But above all, I think it's really vital to look at the systems, the structures, and to recognize that we set up an economic system in this country that made it all but certain that when the pandemic hit, we would be unprepared.